So I'm really thrilled, actually. As I'm sure you can imagine, we weren't sure if we were going to be able to do this session this morning for all of December and most of January because of the shutdown. But I just really want to recognize our federal partners for being here on such short notice. I didn't know what would happen on Monday morning last week, and literally every single one of the people that we had invited to be here emailed me and told me that they were working through the process to get the approval that they needed to be here. And I really appreciated that because it spoke volumes to me on the importance that they placed on being here and being part of this conversation, and the shuffling that they did internally to make sure that all of the topics that we wanted to have covered were covered. And so I just really want to recognize those who are here and those who aren't here but were able to shuffle things around internally to make it so that they could be here. Both USDA and FDA were fantastic, and I just want to acknowledge you all for that. You had 24 hours to make it work, and it was working, and I was getting emails at 6 o'clock on Friday, even from folks who were still trying to figure things out. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And so what the format will be this morning is that individuals will come up and speak, and then I'll have Stephen and Ken and Jody come back up after and sit up here to answer questions. So please hold your questions for the individual speaker until the end, and everybody will come back up as sort of a panel. And that way we will hopefully hear from everybody and get all of your questions answered. So I'll have Stephen start this morning. He's got the biggest list of items. He's going to be speaking both on training and outreach program, the Produce Safety Network, and he'll be doing Cullen's update from the ORA update, regulatory enforcement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen, and let me get your PowerPoint.
No problem. Good morning. Hope everybody is well this morning. It's not often that I hear somebody say that they're thrilled to have FDA here. Usually it's words not quite as kind as that. So thank you again for the opportunity. I'm glad I could make it here. I'm glad I could figure out the travel on such short notice. The real thanks go to the folks who actually process our travel, who helped me get here. So I'll start with a little story first before I get started. Hopefully I won't talk too far beyond my time so that Ken and Jody can talk as well. I was recently talking with a farmer, and I was getting a little bit of the hair dryer treatment. And if you don't know what the hair dryer treatment is, look that up on Google. It's British slang. But I was being told pretty directly that the perception of the farmer was that FDA was intending to put him out of business through the produce safety rule. And, we kind of moved beyond that conversation, started talking about other things, and the concept of diabetes came up and chronic disease. And so I said, these two conversations are actually linked, especially for FDA, because while regulation is certainly part of our portfolio, we are a public health agency. And in the United States, chronic disease, things like diabetes, are a huge burden on society. And one of the things that is most often linked with your health status, so the presence or absence of chronic disease, is actually the consumption of fresh produce, fresh fruits and vegetables. And so I pointed out that, quite the contrary, we're not trying to put him out of business. We want to see increased levels of consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables. And not only is that good for society, as we see increased levels of consumption of fresh produce, we see declining levels of chronic disease, but it's good for his wallet. And so we talked about that a little bit, and I kind of emphasized the fact that, for the farming community, in order to achieve that outcome, in order for all of us to achieve that outcome, we need to make sure that we maintain confidence in our supply of fresh produce. And one of the things that we can do to maintain that confidence is to take steps to prevent outbreaks and contaminated product. And so that's one of the challenges we face both as regulators, as educators, and as industry. How do we prevent outbreaks? How do we take steps to prevent our food from being contaminated? And I think everybody has seen this as you go out. You've never met a farmer who wants to make people sick. It's a pretty poor business model. But I think we've all met farmers who, maybe they don't know where to start when they're attempting to implement the produce safety rule on their farm. Or maybe they're not sure what a particular part of the regulation means. And so as regulators and as educators, we can take steps to work with them to provide the information they need to take those proactive steps on the farm. And everybody benefits from that. And the reason I bring this up is because some data was published in June of 2018 by CDC. And it showed that about 16% of outbreaks between 2010 and 2013 were attributed to produce. And so with every outbreak we see a declining level of confidence in fresh produce. So people shift their spending from a particular commodity to another one. And sometimes they shift their spending from fresh produce to processed food. And so by taking steps to prevent outbreaks, we can reverse this trend. We can increase the consumption of fresh produce, which is not only good for the wallets of industry, but it's also good for society in terms of addressing chronic disease. And we have a roadmap to do that. And that's the produce safety rule, which sets a minimum standard. So it raises the bar at the low end, brings everybody up to a minimum standard in an effort to reduce these outbreaks. And one of the fundamental pillars of our approach for implementing this rule is education and training. I think we've heard it 100 times probably yesterday, educate before and while we regulate. And we've made a number of investments, both FDA and USDA, to make that a reality. Food industry training is, I would say, is the cornerstone of the produce safety rule. It starts with the responsible person on the farm. It continues all the way down to the employees. And in order to make that a reality, FDA and USDA have invested a lot of money in partners to not only develop training to make this happen, but to also disseminate that training. And we recognize that as that training goes out, that multiple formats may be needed, different accommodations may be needed for different audiences, and so we've tried to accommodate that through our different partners. And I'm going to talk briefly about some of the changes in that area in a second. But I did want to take a second to highlight some of the work that was done last year in this area to help make more consistent our discussion of this topic. So back in February of 2018, the Training Advisory Committee, which is made of a number of partners that are involved in FSMA training, got together, and they started to work to develop terms to help clarify what we mean when we're talking about different aspects of training. And I think everybody here understands what the standardized curriculum is. When we think of PSA, when we think of FSPCA, when we think of the Sprout Safety Alliance, these are the curricula that are referenced in the produce safety rule and in other parts of FSMA. But we also have what we would call a modified curriculum. And so these are curricula where maybe the modality changes or an accommodation is made to suit a particular audience. So when we hear people talking about training plain farmers and they're transitioning from a slide deck to maybe paper copies of the material, that's a modified curricula. We also hear a lot about equivalent curricula. And so if you look in the rule in 112.22, we talk about taking training that is equivalent to that of the standardized curricula. So the equivalent curricula is something that achieves the same outcome, maybe with slightly different learning objectives. And then we have what we would call the alternate curriculum. And so the primary difference between that and the equivalent curriculum is that alternate curriculum is something that FDA has recognized. And so I want to direct you, if this is something of interest to you on the clearinghouse, there should be a document that actually outlines these terms and provides consistent definitions, which will help as we talk about training in the future for the farming community. So Chris showed this slide yesterday. It's rather complex. I won't try and explain all of it. I'm not sure I really understand every bit of this after 3 years. But I will say that there have been a few changes in the partners that we have been funding over the last few years. So one of the partners that we had that was helping to coordinate some of the training work for FSMA, the National Coordination Center, they've since gone away. Their funding stream ended in the summer of 2018. As Chris mentioned, we were also seeing a transition in funding as the regional centers shift to funding from USDA. So right now, 2 of them are funded by FDA, and that's coming to a close. But we're also seeing the addition of another partner, and that's the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. So recently, we partnered with NSAC to develop an alternate training curriculum for the produce safety rule that targets small and diversified operators and limited resource or socially disadvantaged farmers. The focus of this funding is on the development of an alternate curriculum, so just the development of that alternate curriculum. It's not focused on delivery, outreach, training, or technical assistance associated with that curriculum. And so that leads to a question that comes up pretty routinely when we talk about training, and that's the recognition of alternate curricula. So many folks out there are interested in steps that FDA is taking to recognize curricula other than the standardized curricula. We've heard that question. We recognize that's an important topic. And so one of the things we've been working on and that we plan to issue is draft guidance to actually describe what it means to be an equivalent curricula, or equivalent or alternate curricula to the PSA standardized curriculum. So in addition to that, so that kind of describes what equivalent means or what it will mean. But in addition to that, we're working on a process. So we plan to work closely with NIFA, and I think you'll hear more about this from Jody, and the regional centers to describe a process for evaluating alternate curricula. Our plan is that the regional center would develop a framework based on the FDA guidance to review and evaluate this alternate curriculum. The regional centers would receive requests for evaluation of alternate curricula, while a rubric to standardize the review process and provide feedback to the training developer on modifications needed to achieve equivalence to that PSA standardized curricula. FDA then would complete a final review and recognition provided that the curriculum met the minimum standards for equivalency. So we would expect that the work that NSAC would do would happen in conjunction with input from FDA and the regional center to assess that alternate curricula for equivalence, and then, if necessary, they would make any changes to achieve that equivalency. And the work with NSAC in conjunction with FDA and the regional centers would also serve to pilot the process to see how it goes, which would inform the finalization of that draft guidance for equivalent curricula. So that's a pretty significant change from what's outlined here, and I would expect in the near future that folks, there'll be some opportunities to hear a little bit more about what NSAC is doing and how that will fit into the changes and how the regional centers are operating and being funded. So in addition to the education work that we've been funding through some of these organizations, FDA is obviously working very hard on education and outreach to the farming community on the produce safety rule. And that's one of the things that the Produce Safety Network focuses on quite a bit. So we're in the very early innings of the produce safety rule. So I like to think of it, we're literally at the top of the first inning. So we haven't quite started inspections with the exception of a few states. And so we're in a mode where it's very important to provide clarity on what the rule means. So people see the rule and it can be somewhat abstract. As you start to go out on the farm, you start to have questions, you start to think about the rule in the context of specific situations, and you start to get into some of the meaty topics. And so we have a couple of ways of addressing these questions and providing clarity on the rule. I think everybody here is familiar with the Technical Assistance Network. It provides a mechanism for us to answer questions in a way that ensures vetting by different program offices in the center. It's a very formal process. It also tends to be somewhat slow, which I think most folks here are aware of. And so one of the things FDA recognized when we were implementing the produce safety rule was the need for folks that are throughout the country who are able to answer questions to be an accessible resource and who can answer questions in the context of regional conditions, practices, and challenges. And so that's one of the things the Produce Safety Network does. I think most folks here are maybe familiar with Socrates Trujillo. He's one of the folks on my team. We have 5 other folks at this point throughout the country that perform a similar role to what he does. And so that provides another mechanism for the agency to provide clarity on the rule. Since 2017, we've gotten probably 350 questions through the network. So this is outside of the TAN, so in addition to what we're getting through the TAN. Response time is fairly quick, so median response of about a day and a half, probably also a little bit faster than the TAN. And one of the unique things about this is that we're able to pretty quickly identify what the questions are, what the key areas are that people are having trouble understanding. And so in 2018, almost 50% of the questions, I would say, focused on whether, am I covered? So it was, understanding what constitutes food sales, what constitutes produce sales, whether somebody fits under the qualified exemption, how the farm definition applies to certain operations. So this is the bulk of the questions, very similar to 2017 as well. In the other areas of the rule, so not quite as many questions about the more technical areas of the rule yet. I anticipate that will change as folks are doing on-farm readiness reviews and inspections. But the key areas so far have been ag water, not surprising, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and domesticated and wild animals. So what do we do with this information? So like I said, one of the nice things about having sort of the separate process that's a little bit more responsive is that we can also take this information fairly quickly and develop material to address some of these information gaps. So one of the first fact sheets that we developed as a result of some of the questions that many of you asked was on the rarely consumed raw list. So an explanation of why we have that list, how we got there, kind of the meaning of it. We also took some of the questions that we were getting early in 2018 to publish a fact sheet on biological soil amendments of animal origin. And then given some of the cyclosporiasis issues in the Southwest, we also published another fact sheet addressing that issue. But given some of the other key topic areas you see there, there are a few more fact sheets that we have in the pipeline that I would anticipate releasing in 2019. One dealing with the qualified exemption, another dealing with dropped covered produce, which I know came up a couple of times yesterday, another dealing with domesticated and wild animals, and then another one dealing with training. So again, the questions that you bring to us, the questions that hopefully we're able to answer for you, we take those questions and we try and incorporate them into material which can then be shared further. And we also tend to translate these into Spanish for those of you who have a Spanish-speaking population. So in addition to that, we have another tool that we'll be rolling out this year. That's the Regulator TAN. So for those of you who are familiar with the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with Regis Philbin, you probably remember the concept of phoning a friend. And so this is a resource that will be devoted to inspections. So many of the questions that we get are outside of a regulatory activity, so they're not associated necessarily with somebody being on the farm at that point in time. And so what we recognize is that as folks start to do an inspection, they're very likely to start coming into situations where they maybe need a little bit of feedback. And so the Regulator TAN is an appointment-based system that will be available to investigators and FDA as well as inspectors at state agencies. It's an appointment system, so folks will set up appointments ahead of time. They'll have an SME during that appointment window that will be accessible to talk with them during the inspection, provide feedback on questions they may have. And so we would anticipate providing feedback during the inspection on things like the farm definition, specific produce safety rule provisions and the associated guidance, as well as corrective actions if issues are found on the farm, and inspectional approach. So again, it's sort of a phone-a-friend system to help facilitate consistent inspections across the United States. So similarly to what we do with questions that we already get, we'll use some of the information that we bring in through the Regulator TAN to inform some of our guidance work, as well as the development of fact sheets and other training material. And I did want to highlight one thing here. I know there's some sensitivity about farm names, identifying information, and the point of the Regulator TAN is not to collect that type of information. It's a focus just on the technical question. So what the question is, what the answer is. We're not going to be collecting addresses, farm identification information, things like that. So in addition to providing clarity on the rule, many of you may have already been out in the field with Socrates in the Northeast. So we continue to get out in the field on educational farm visits. These visits help to inform some of our policy work back in the center, so on things like agricultural water, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and the farm definition. So I know we had a visit in Pennsylvania to produce auction, terminal market in New York. I think there was an ag water tour in Vermont and New Hampshire in the beginning of 2008, and a composting facility we looked at in Maryland this year. And I expect that type of work to continue as we go forward. We'll continue to use that as a way to bring information back to the center to inform some of that work. In addition to that, like many of you, we're also offering on-farm readiness reviews. So in states where the agency there doesn't have a cooperative agreement with FDA, so that would be Illinois, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Puerto Rico. We are offering on-farm readiness reviews directly to the farming community. In Kentucky, they do have a cooperative agreement, so we're working with them to continue to offer that since they were a latecomer to the cooperative agreement program. So we've had a lot of success in Puerto Rico and Kentucky, and one of the things I wanted to highlight here, if you're just starting that program, we did demonstrations there. So before we started to advertise it, we did a demonstration in Kentucky at a research farm, and then we did a demonstration in Puerto Rico at one of at the farm run by the head of I think the Banana Association there. And what this enabled us to do in a fairly relaxed atmosphere was to walk industry through what an on-farm readiness review looked like, enabled a discussion of the process, and I think we helped to ease some of their concerns. And what we found in both cases is that many folks signed up that day. So I think that was a successful model. If you're having trouble getting people to sign up, I'd encourage you to think about doing that. So in addition to our domestic work, we'll also be offering international on-farm readiness reviews. And so, the question you might ask yourself is why FDA is doing this. And so there are two reasons. So first, we're a signatory to the World Trade Organization, and so there's a concept that I'll struggle to articulate, but I'll try, and that's the idea of similar treatment. So what we do here, we're expected to do internationally. Doesn't mean we're the bank for the world, but we have to have a similar approach. But also in FSMA, in Section 305, there's an expectation that FDA does capacity building internationally. So we develop the scientific, the technical, and the regulatory capacity of foreign governments. And so when you think about the amount of produce that comes into the United States, that makes a lot of sense. It's helpful to get them in a position to enhance the safety of produce in their country before it comes here. So on-farm readiness reviews will provide a way for us to make some of that happen. A couple of limitations, and I'm running a little over my time, so I apologize, Ken and Jody. Relative to the domestic program, we have a limited amount of staff over a much larger area, Central America and Latin America. Central America and South America is where we're going to focus our time. We also have a limited amount of funding relative to that broad geographic area. And then obviously in Latin America, the Spanish-speaking farmers are predominant, as well as Portuguese-speaking farmers. And so that's a language barrier that we're going to have a challenge with. So in light of that, there are kind of two parts of our approach. So similarly to what you're doing domestically, we're going to be conducting a limited number of FDA-led on-farm readiness reviews in Latin America. And then in conjunction with that, we'll probably spend some time training foreign governments to offer on-farm readiness reviews in their own countries. So our initial focus will be Chile, Costa Rica, and Mexico. And that's both given our relationships with those governments and the amount of produce coming from those countries to the United States. So why are we focusing on Latin America? If you look at the top 10 countries exporting fresh produce to the United States, among the 10, 8 of them are in Latin America. The other 2 are Canada and the Netherlands. And it depends a little bit on how you look at that data. But Canada and the Netherlands have fairly developed food safety systems, whereas I don't think you can say the same about many of the food safety systems in Latin America. So that's why we're focusing our time there. And then focusing on Chile, Costa Rica, and Mexico, again, that's a function of our existing relationships with those governments, as well as some interest we're already aware of for the On-Farm Readiness Review Program. And so finally, I'll end on this slide. We talked a lot about education, about on-farm readiness reviews, about training, but obviously we have a regulatory role, and so our colleagues in the Office of Regulatory Affairs work extensively in that area. So if you were following the news, you're aware of the leafy green outbreak that was traced back to the Southwest. You're aware of the cyclosporiasis issues in 2018. And so our ORA colleagues are very busy working through those investigations. So when we start to detect signals, those are the folks that go out and do the investigations. They work directly with the farmers and the state partners to make that work happen. So 2018 was a busy year for them. And then obviously, just like you, they are preparing for inspections this year. So I'll stop there. Elizabeth, I don't know how you want to.
Yeah, let's wait on questions.
Okay.
Because I don't want to take up too much of Jody's. Thank you, Stephen, very much.